So for human-oriented resources, we have this awkward wording because this is not human resources. Okay, this is not you being a human resources person at a National Park Service spot. There are human resources officers at national parks and stuff like that, but that's not really what we care about in forestry. So what I'm more talking about is stuff out there in the field that are a lot of these points of interest on the maps of your chosen national parks this semester. So, again, just recapping from earlier, just brief mentions of the human resource types, we have archaeological, which are mostly going to be prehistoric, meaning pre-invention of writing. We'll have historic resources, which is more recent past stuff. We'll have cultural resources, which are current living cultures that overlap and intersect with the places we're managing as parks. Maybe they used to be, territory for indigenous folks, Native Americans, First Nation folks, whatever. Instead of kind of locking folks out from places their ancestors lived anyway, let's open the door. Let's have some cultural festivals. Let's learn how folks eat and perform important life landmark rituals like marriage ceremonies that don't have anything to do with sort of Western Christian style churches or vows or anything like we're generally used to, okay, for the most part. There are lots of different ways of being here in America, and our parks are increasingly a venue to not only showcase that which is different from like the normal default stuff, but every bit as interesting and like deeply textured and complex as what we are personally navigating through as well. It's really cool stuff to go to the Grand Canyon. We were shooting on this for summer camp. I am still salty about it, of going to Grand Canyon, South Rim Village, and getting to show all the campers all sorts of amazing, there are tons of different Native American nations right around that spot. And they have every license to be there, every right to be, every desire to be there. And we get to see how they make clothing instead of going to forever insert arbitrary age name or Abergucci and Fitch or whatever it is. And it's amazing. Okay? It's really cool to see, and it helps challenge a lot of the assumptions that you and I have as folks. So while we don't necessarily think of sitting down across the table from, a Native American off of a nearby tribal lands or reservation and just having a chat about, what is life like for you? How is it kind of the same or different? We don't really think about that maybe automatically in terms of recreation management, but our national parks are the primo vehicle for having some of those cool conversations. Like, if you've never been to a legit trading post, that's a thing. Like, if you've never had traditional Native American foods prepared off of a landscape that looks barren and desert and dry and dead, that's a thing, and it's awesome. It's awesome. So that's cool. It's a chance for people to just kind of tell their stories a little bit. So we want to give some good attention to managing that, facilitating that, being an open conduit for that stuff to happen instead of kind of fencing off our parks like we used to do ecologically and socially, and instead keeping things open and flowing and meaningfully working with folks. So, for example, the botanists on the Shawnee. Shawnee is a national forest, not a national park, but the same principle applies. The botanists on the Shawnee have every responsibility to catalog and map and do landscape and ecological restoration for rare, threatened, and endangered plant species, particularly the the remnant glacial species that were pushed right to the Shawnee Bluff lines when the glaciers sort of came down through what is now Canada and pushed those seeds, those biological communities southward in front of the mile-thick ice wall. Then when those glaciers receded, those plants were trapped here. They're still around. They're super common for northern central Canada, and they're incredibly rare and almost alien here. But they're here in these tiny little pockets of soil in the Bluff line and on the Shawnee and other places like that, okay? Draper's Bluff, stuff like that. So they have a huge responsibility to catalog those things, and that's like a forestry resources kind of a task. Botanizing, identifying species, mapping them out, GPSing, all that stuff. Running fire across the land appropriately to preserve those fragile and kind of trapped species in those spots, etc., etc. But that's only one perspective on the value of any of the plant species or the wildlife species on the Shawnee. The Native Americans saw this landscape in some very similar ways to us, like we produce a lot of delicious foods and drinks off of Southern Illinois farmland and row cropping and wineries and stuff like that. Well, the Native Americans who lived here and were the sort of dominant human presence at the time, they also used that landscape for food, but in a totally different way than row cropping, for the most part. Yeah? So, we open up those conversations. This is in recreation management. This is called cataloging and social mapping for alternate ways of knowing. So it is a lot of people's jobs, and this sounds like a pretty sweet job to me. But jumping out in a canoe with like a tribe's medicine person or healer or like a shaman type role, and just walking through the woods or going to some isolated islands in a paddle craft that's not gonna disrupt the local species and stuff like that with a dirty 2-stroke engine, and just walking around and pointing at that plant and going, okay, so I know this as Huachuca water umbel. What do your people know this as? What's its name? How do you value it? What do you use it for? Is this a traditional medicine? And so forth. Okay? And that's cool. Like, that is, aside from the functional, the instrumental values of those plants as medicine or as ecosystem members of that particular community, there's a cultural value to them as well. Okay? So, our national symbol, the eagle, is highly protected because, you know, Joni Mitchell writing songs about not getting spots on our apples, leave me the birds and the bees, I don't like DDT. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you got till it's gone, right? Counting Crows made a pretty sweet remake of it, I think with Vanessa What's-Her-Face. Anyway, there are other than instrumental Western values attached to all this stuff. And for every culture that has used a landscape, that has occupied a landscape, that has lived with a landscape, it's a whole other layer of meanings, uses, values, and so forth. So, our national symbol, the bald eagle. For us, it's something we put on a flag, or state insignia, or whatever. For some Native American folks, they use the feathers for headdresses, for specific ceremonial rites. We would never use the word costume because you guys don't come to class in a costume. Well, a Native American doesn't do a ritual in a costume. It's just what they're wearing, right? So, they are allowed to, under U.S. federal law, allowed to take, harvest, hunt bald eagles in a way that pretty much the rest of us are not, for ceremonial, for religious, for cultural uses. And the only reason that's a thing is because we all, as a country of many nations, had to work together on figure out what are the appropriate uses of bald eagles. We're going to outlaw certain industrial chemicals like DDT that harm nesting birds and make their shells a little bit too thin to sit on and incubate, because we value eagles as a national symbol. For Native American of nations that pay attention to bald eagles culturally, like around Southern Illinois, we need to know that they do that. Otherwise, the danger is we write some laws saying you can't hunt bald eagles, period. All right, so for a lot of the Alaskan national parks and wildlife refuges and so forth, the 1980 Alaska National Interest Land Conservation Act, ANILCA, of 1980, doubled the size of the territory managed by the Park Service with a single signature out of the president's office at the time. Doubled the entire National Park Service's landmass. And there are a bunch of Native Alaskans living in the places that became national parks and wildlife refuges and national forests up there and all of that stuff. Okay? So part of those creations had to factor in the fact that, you know, if we fence off Denali National Park from the Native Americans legit living in and around that area and stop the caribou migration, so we are protecting the wildlife by enclosing it in this park, this wilderness area, managing it, doing good habitat stuff, getting population numbers up and so forth, all of a sudden we got a bunch of Native Americans either going to federal prison for poaching on federal lands or starving to death. So there are exceptions to hunting and fishing and other kinds of land use actions, extractive land uses, in national parks, because we are, as you know, generally derived from Western European stock. We're not the only show in town. Okay? So it falls to us as park managers to obviously follow the law for stuff like that, but also to be kind of proactive in reaching out and saying, hey, let's make some connections here. We really want to know. We need to know, in order to be functional foresters in this place, how did your forebears use each of these species? Which ones are valuable to you? Which ones have a place in your cosmogony, in your culture's creation myths? Now, I'm not using myth in the term of falsehood. I'm using myth in the term of story that explains part of reality for a culture. Okay? Cool. That's important to wrestle with for a sec. So in several southwestern Native American cultures, the coyote has huge mythic importance. Thunderbird has huge mythic importance. Exactly the same way a bald eagle has national cultural importance to all of us around here. Okay? Is this making sense? Generally with younger generations, this is like mostly already sort of okay, you know, being culturally sensitive and stuff like that, but sometimes we gotta just kind of pick it apart. What does this really mean on a day-to-day, I'm a park ranger basis? So it might mean, again, getting in a canoe with somebody and having them teach you what's the botany of your culture. What's the name of this in your culture? What times of year how did you gather these or cull these for medicinal or ceremonial or religious or other kinds of cultural uses and so forth. This is a huge, huge deal. The Park Service is trying to help lead the charge on this. Most of the other federal agencies are generally at least on board, but trying to kind of recalibrate from that old school so-called rational, comprehensive resource management approach where a bunch of experts in DC set policy and then it just trickles down from there out to specific forests and parks and districts and down to individual sites. Now we're trying to make everything much more tightly coupled to the people actually there. Imagine that. Okay? So, for your park, take a moment to think about what are the prehistoric archaeological resources, the historic archaeological resources in the United States, that is federally defined as typically any cultural remains more than 50 years old. What are the cultural resources present? Okay. So in the middle third of our semester coming up, we're going to be talking about how the human recreationist works on the inside, this weird, soft, wet computer that is our brains. How do we think about recreation? What does that lead to? What does that make us need for recreation management? And I jokingly refer to the human species as another strange, wild, and wonderful wildlife species to be managed. What I don't want to do is refer to current cultures of fellow human beings as another strange wildlife species to manage. That might come across the wrong way. So let's just camp on that for a sec and clarify that we're gonna pay full respect to everybody involved, because we haven't always done a great job of that in the past as a culture. So there's that. So for your park, what are the prehistoric archaeological resources? The historic, post-invention of writing archaeological resources. What are the current cultural resources? What are the cultures present? Who are the peoples, plural? Okay. So when you get into higher and higher level park management, you stop hearing about the monolithic idea of serving the public. It becomes, we are serving many publics, plural. And we can't lump them all together in any effective or useful way. So we want to know, what's the variety out there? What's the range? What's the depth of each of these? What's the texture and the interesting quirks of all of these different cultures, all of these different publics present and wanting to be present on the lands that we're managing, but maybe don't have the economic standing to be able to participate as much as they want. Like, they can't afford it. We want that to be our problem. We want to take that on and extend that access to folks in a meaningful and effective way, for sure. All right. Does anybody know? We haven't really had a chance to dig into it yet, but a priori or at the beginning, anybody know if you have any human type resources at your park this semester? Sugar. What do you mean by sugar? That sounds like sugar cane, meaning a vegetation species. How's that a human cultural thing?
They mined it. And I guess you would call it mined it, but they used it and sold it. Probably different parts of the island at one point, and then I'm sure they branched out to different parts of the world.
Yeah, so sugar plantations are a huge deal in the Caribbean and in parts of places like Hawaii. It just grows like gangbusters out there. And that land use is a part of the cultures of those places, the history of those places, and ag extractive use is often pretty obtrusive on the landscape, so we want to have that story. The fact of sugar being used in things like alcohol production and being so valuable at one time with tallmaster ships that we have things like piracy involving this and human slavery involving this stuff means that there's a lot to unpack there for visitors to the Virgin Islands in this case. So yeah, we want to know about that. Even though as foresters we're not really thinking about being sugar farmers, what's kind of the history of it? We're in charge of curating those artifacts, those stories, those sites, wherever they fall inside the boundaries of our parks. So, awesome. What else? Other current or historic or prehistoric human artifacts? Pretty much all the urban proximate parks and things that are run by the Park Service but not called national parks are specifically focused on this. So there are these places called heritage corridors in downtown Cleveland and Boston, and the National Mall is run by the U.S. National Park Service, and it's a pretty elite place to be able to work. The demands there are intense. These heritage corridors were set up by the Park Service so that we could have national park units inside of urban spaces, because not everybody can afford to get to Yellowstone or the Virgin Islands, especially these days with travel being so weird. Not everybody even has the cultural value attached to forest and outdoor recreation. That some of us coming from a dominantly Caucasian, Western European cultural heritage have attached to forest and outdoor recreation. Okay? So, for example, it's long been sort of documented that folks who identify as Hispanic, which is not a racial classification, it's a cultural one. You can have whatever different skin color and be Hispanic. Are you a Spanish-speaking culture or Spanish-derived speaking culture? That's one way to define Hispanic. They tend to recreate in very different places and different group sizes and for different reasons than somebody like me, my ancestors came from Germany and Scotland and Ireland and Scandinavia, and that's kind of it, right? This is why we're sitting in the shade, because I'm super pale white, and I'm probably still getting a tan. But not everybody's exactly like me, and that's fine. That's cool. It's interesting, right? Park Service realized, gosh, we see a lot of the same usual suspects at our parks, kind of disproportionately able to take advantage of these amazing hikes and paddle trips and cruise stops and all of this stuff, versus some of these other cultural groups or subcultural groups that are maybe more interested in or just don't have a vocabulary for going to parks as like a trip. Like, that doesn't seem like an interesting thing. So I want to be very careful in kind of describing cultural groups that I'm not a part of, because I'm describing them from the outside using very sort of reductionistic, statistical and survey-based techniques. But those are a set of tools that we have as park managers to kind of understand, hey, where's everybody else? We want everybody coming to all of our parks like as much as possible. This is awesome. More people in the gate is better. More different kinds of people in the gate, way better. But it's not always happening. So, for example, some African Americans have reported when, engaging in some of these conversations, that parks look a lot like forests to somebody who's grown up in, let's say, certain districts of Chicago or St. Louis or other more urban areas that tend to have a much higher proportion of African American population. And forested areas, to some folks with an African American background, kind of don't feel particularly safe, because that's where their recent ancestors got lynched. So in the early part of the last century, people were getting hanged for the color of their skin, mostly in the southern United States, pretty much every day, at least one or a couple. And so people remember that. And you can imagine how, whether or not people are getting lynched in our national forests, or in our case for this class, our national parks, much at all anymore, that matters less than the perception and the memory of it. Does that make sense? So if this is somebody like, my great uncle was found hanged in front of this patch of the woods where some other group of racists or whatever dragged him in there and strung him up. Why would I get excited about going to the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and like the 5 or 6 national forests ringing Yellowstone National Park? It's gorgeous up there. It's amazing. It's an awesome trip. And for African Americans who do that, it's perfectly fine and accessible. But for some, it's a non-starter, because the perception, the memory of that kind of trauma is still pretty intense. There have been some really, really interesting neuroscience studies. This has nothing to do with forestry, but just interesting aside. Some really cool neuroscience studies of MRI and fMRI, so soft tissue brain structure and brain function, respectively. MRI, fMRI studies of people who've gone through serious trauma, like who have experienced like violent outbreaks of racism against them personally or against their loved ones. And it measurably, visibly changes the structure and function of the human brain to have endured that. Okay, so this is a real thing. We want to pay attention to it. There is literal, honest to God, like visible evidence of this is a before, this is an after, look how these are different following that traumatic act. So this stuff has an impact. And as park rangers, right, racism it's not our fault, but it is our opportunity to kind of bridge past those perceived barriers, those belief barriers, those historic barriers, and get some more folks into these amazing national parks and forests and hunting areas and everything else, right? Pretty cool stuff. It's a very noble thing. Anybody who's had a chance to introduce a buddy to hunting or backpacking or kayaking or rock climbing or whatever for the first time, there's a lot of people like ripe for that first time, for that sense of discovery and joy and challenge and all of it, all the values we have for forest rec and using our wildlands for non-extractive purposes. So pretty cool stuff. Okay. Other cultural or historic or prehistoric resources that you might be aware of on your park so far. Obviously, one of our assignments for the class after today's class is going to be to crack open the Park Service website, and they'll have some hints for you on the park brochure map, usually on the back side with little blurbs of what's interesting about this place. They add a bunch of cultural things as well as physical resource things like our forest, tree species, and hydrologic resources, and so on and so forth. Okay? This is a first class kind of resource. It's right up there in importance and the effort that is put into managing and protecting these resources as well. We didn't know a ton of stuff about modern forestry back in 1960 when we created the Park Service with that Organic Act that year. But even then, the Park Service is specifically created to protect and provide access to cultural, archaeological, historic, prehistoric stuff. It's right there in the text. So even back then, when we didn't know much, we knew that was important. So this is why we're spending at least today on it. Anybody else? With a human type resource in or around your park? Is anybody pretty sure that you don't have any? Every once in a while we get something like that, but usually there's something. Okay, so that goes on our list. Take a second to crack open the website and the resources you started to gather for your park and start cataloging again, like with vegetation species, wildlife species. What's the short list of some of the critical ones for your particular park or protected area? All right. In the past kind of 15 to 20 years, more advanced park management and research efforts have been focusing on the cultural situation outside and at the border of parks, just beyond the border. So very commonly with grad students, a project can be to research what's the effect of a park like U.S. Virgin Islands on indigenous folks that lived in that space prior to it. And then they had to move out because it's now a national park. That's a thing that happens. And it's happened recently too. Most commonly in Central America, South America, and places like that are catching up with the U.S. on establishing parks and biosphere reserves and so forth. but that also have, indigenous cultures just like we do. So there's this question of, are parks automatically good neighbors? If you are a landowner, let's say you have, for the last 5 generations, a hunting cabin out in Wyoming, and your family is all about, like Joe Rogan style, filling up multiple chest style freezers with elk. Can you pull that up, Jamie? Blah, 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 right? Like, elk hunting is a part of your family's DNA almost. And then in Wyoming, all of a sudden, right there, you have Grand Teton National Park just created. And your cabin is physically touching the border of the park. Is that a good thing or a bad thing for you as an elk hunting family? What do you think?
Better know the boundaries.
Better know those boundaries.
Better have your property surveyed.
Yeah.
Okay. Why?
You don't get arrested on accident.
Why would you get arrested on accident? You're just at the cabin, right?
Random people come to your house.
Yeah, some
Property.
Yeah.
They can go to the boundary.
Yeah, millions of people are going to start coming to your immediate vicinity. And even if, let's say, 99% of a million people are respectful and well-informed that this is not a Park Service cabin, this is private property, this is somebody's place. Even 1% of a million people is, what, 10,000 people a year running afoul of your property? That's insane. That's a problem. That's your problem now. Like, the Park Service just parachuted this amazing national park into place on the map, and now you got to deal with 10,000 trespassers a year? Like, that's probably changed everything that you value about that cabin, about that tradition, about that property, yeah? So you can see how there's a lot of people who are still pretty pissed off about being unwilling neighbors to national parks or state parks or forests or whatever, right? Other protected areas, but because parks tend to enshrine and protect some of the most scenic, high-value recreational land, the places around them, landowners around them, tend to get pretty heated about choices that they, for a long time, up until the 1960s at the earliest, had zero legal voice in. And to this day, people are setting arson fires in Great Smoky Mountains National Park because they're pissed off that their great-granddad or great-grandmom lost their cabin in Cades Cove or wherever else, any of the other coves that are now that particular park. It's the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Do you know how hard you have to work to set forest fires in the Great Smoky Mountains that are so rainy they're cloudy all the time, and they're called the Smoky Mountains? It's one of the most intensely populated salamander habitats anywhere in the world. Like, it's a wet place, and folks are mad about being unwilling neighbors there. So we want to add to our resources inside our boundary that we are specifically responsible for protecting and preserving, but also providing and curating. We want to add, what's our relations with our neighbors, okay? Now, this is also something that we really, 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 really got to know about for your park this semester. And it's way harder to capture or find information on this sometimes until recently. Because the Park Service, maybe they don't even realize that there are some pissed off people nearby. Like, if you're not on speaking terms with the Park Service, and the Park Service hires an SIU forestry junior over the summer to go work at U.S. Virgin Islands, and you drop in there for 3-4 months to, do some good land management, some good park management, you haven't had a chance to talk with anybody who lives nearby, and they're not going to seek you out because maybe they're mad, right? So, usually, being a park ranger is a super popular, highly sought-after thing, but for specific communities, sometimes right on the borders of these parks, it's kind of a black mark on your interactions with folks just right out the gate. They see you in the greens and grays, the uniform, and they they're making a lot of assumptions about you as representing a major, powerful land management agency at the federal level. Okay? So, do a little bit of Googling around for this. You may wish to use scholar.google.com specifically to find research about parks being neighbors, specifically mentioning your park. Okay? I'm sure this would never happen in reality, but you could imagine some people in the National Park Service being pretty good at land management and like forestry field work and stuff like that, but not being super interested in the human cultures and residents nearby and so forth, and just through a process of focusing on other things, not engaging in any of those conversations, not seeking to bridge some of those gaps and so forth. And that's definitely never been a problem of somebody not wanting to know if there's a problem, if that makes sense. Definitely that's never happened before, and I'm not being ironic or sarcastic. Right? So, we might have to look in some different places to uncover relationships between your national park and human communities around it. Generally, national parks are really unambiguously good for biological communities around that park because we're trying to pull out invasives, remove invasives, transport pressure to these adjacent places. But for the human communities, it's not automatically quite as good. Okay? Native Hawaiians have some legit gripes with how Haleakala National Park has been managed. Hawaiian kings and queens, their royalty, are buried inside of the lava tubes inside the park. And for a while, they were sort of cut off from access for visiting the tombs of their royalty. Imagine Britain declaring the National Mall in Washington, D.C. a British national park and forbidding access to the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial and saying, we're actually gonna tell the history of General Cornwallis in the Revolutionary War from the British perspective here. That's a little bit what it's like maybe for a native Hawaiian to think about practicing their cultural traditions and ceremonies and rites and stuff like that with their royalty buried inside of one of our national parks. And the Park Service may or may not, depending on how far they are on this effort, they've really tried to steer the ship in a more constructive direction, but they may or may not call attention to these dynamics. In wilderness management, we're talking about Ozark Scenic Riverways. We're going there for our field trip in a couple of weeks. And it's the same thing, but the folks that got their land taken away happen to look a little bit more like most of us in this class. Basically, early western settlers to southern Missouri, setting up subsistence farmland and stuff like that, and farming out those hills pretty hard. Like one-room schoolhouses, like super, like Little House on the Prairie type life, for those of you familiar with that kind of set of books. And that's a thing. That place was created in 1968, so a lot of people who had their land seized through the process of eminent domain, where we turn privately owned land into a public place like a park or a forest or what have you. Same thing happened on the Shawnee way back when. There are still people alive that, born easily before 1968. You don't even have to be that old, really, to remember losing your family's farm and having it turned into what is now a unit of the National Park Service. It's not a national park, but it's a unit of. So, this is a thing. And sometimes the federal government can be equal opportunity offenders, right? Like, everybody gets screwed when we all take lands from all over the place and turn them into national parks. It's more just a question of how long has it been since we did that? Are those people still around? So keep an eye out for that. The way that you'll see this, the way that the Park Service does tend to talk about some of these issues and potential conflicts and potential sort of beefs that people have, is to try and start telling those stories from the first person lived perspective of people. So archival recordings. When we go to Mammoth Cave, they're going to have a bunch of archival recordings. Whether or not that section of the visitor center is open due to COVID or not, we'll see. But they have like some of the earliest footage recorded on actual film when it was measured in feet of film recorded footage, was taken in parks of beautiful places in the very, very early 1900s. Some of the very first motion pictures. And so they go back into the archives and they let those things speak for themselves instead of kind of imposing a narrative on top of it. And trying to tell the stories of some of those farmers that got bought out at Mammoth Cave, or on the Shawnee, or out at Ozark Scenic Riverways out west, and all over the rest of, the United States. And just trying to sort of get out of the way, step away from the mic, and let the cultures displaced do some of the talking. So that's how that might show up. It's not necessarily labeled as the Park Service removed all these people from their land by an act of Congress in 1960 whatever. It'll be more of a, hey, this is what this schoolhouse used to look like. Here's a recreation of it in our lobby. And here's some of the actual desks recovered from a shuttered schoolhouse in this valley about 3 miles from here, and so forth. So trying to tell the story through the objects, through the first-person testimony of the people who grew up in that one-room schoolhouse, and stuff like that. So that's what that'll look like on the Park Service website, or the Friends of website. Maybe your national park has a Friends of website that has a bunch of historic and cultural interpretation resources. Check those out. All right? Cool. So, any questions on the in-park resources? Cultural, historic, prehistoric? Or the park proximal cultural milieu going on? In the research, if you decide to go to scholar.google.com, the catchphrase that was used for this area of research was, does such and such a place make a good neighbor? That's sort of a catch-all term for community relations, land use side effects, for sort of literal takeover of those parcels. Do such and such park, or do parks in general, do forests make good neighbors? All right? In the same way that a lot of the research back in the day on the physical impact dynamics that we've been talking about for soil, water, vegetation, one of the big research catchphrases was, are we loving our parks to death? And then the research article will go into detail. This article is looking at the nene goose, or the ahina, the silver sword plant at Haleakala National Park, or the corals outside of, or underwater at U.S. Virgin Islands, that sort of thing. Is it being loved to death? Are we bringing recreation use in that's impacting or harming these vegetation or wildlife or water quality, air quality, whatever it was, whatever that resource is? Is it getting loved to death? Because folks aren't showing up to your park to beat it to death for the most part, but we can kind of hug things to death accidentally. So for those of you born as millennials or Zoomers, so-called digital nomads, you may be familiar with one of the busiest sites on the internet called Reddit. And when Reddit links millions of daily users to some small random website that happens to be funny or interesting or controversial or whatever, it gets the RHOD, the Reddit hug of death. And the website goes down typically for days at a time while the website owner is like, what just happened? Why is my server on fire from all this traffic? The same thing can happen with physical bodies at parks. Okay? Cool. So any questions about resources inside or proximal to parks? Again, the third sort of galaxy brain strategy of the U.S. National Park Service in recent time, like the past 15 or 20 years. Mainly, they've started going hard on it. The third part of that, so inside the border, next to the border, the third strategy was to create places like heritage corridors, the Blackstone River Corridor in the Northeast, the Cuyahoga River Corridor in Cleveland. The Cuyahoga River in the 60s, does anybody know why the Cuyahoga River is famous? It's not because it's a wild or beautiful river. This is a little bit before your time, but anybody know why the Cuyahoga River was kind of famous?
Caught on fire.
It caught on fire from all of the industrial and pollution discharge on it. Like, there were that many volatile chemicals on it. The Ganges River in India does the same thing regularly. Just unregulated industrial discharge. We get the Clean Water Act as a result of the environmental movement in the 60s and 70s. We get the Clean Air Act, etc. Places like this start to clean up, and the industrial sort of setup in downtown Boston and downtown Cleveland and all these other major cities, New York, that starts to shift away from like dirty industrial factories for the most part. A lot of that industrial manufacturing goes over to Southeast Asia afterwards. And then now it's going a lot to sub-Saharan Africa, getting set up over there. As regulations get tighter here, and then more recently in Southeast Asia, a lot of that stuff's moving around the globe to wherever they can get away with it. But that process of industrialization, starting in the 1700s, that was a huge, huge shaping force, along with the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, sort of an intellectual revolution, the first chance for Europe and later American or North American societies to start pulling away from religion being the dominant social forces. We have things like scientific explanations of things instead of mythological ones, and so forth. So the Industrial Revolution was a part of that sort of trifecta, starting in the 1700s with early steam-powered, water-powered factories, steam power in the 1800s, and then fossil fuel-powered in 1900s and beyond. It's a huge piece of what made America what it is. Like, that industrial capacity, we cleaned house in World War I and especially in World War II. Like, we just bombed the heck out of Germany and Japan and so forth, because we had the industrial capacity and the resources to back up and feed that industrial capacity. So those factories are a part of our culture, our history, post-invention of writing. And so the Park Service is like, why are we completely missing the bus or the train on these? Why don't we tell these stories too, instead of just the story of Lewis and Clark along the Lewis and Clark Trail, the stories of some of these Native American cultures in places like the Grand Canyon and at Zion and Bryce and all the Red Rocks country out there. Okay? So, 3-pronged strategy. Think, and this is a question you should be able to answer without doing much research on it, but was your park created in the first wave between 1872, the creation of the first U.S. National Park, Yellowstone, and about 1945 or so? Was it a first wave park? Was it a second wave park as we take a second look at all American lands between about 1945 and about, let's say, 1995, where we get some of the smaller ones, some of the closer to home ones, some of the ones that tend to focus a little bit more on human, cultural, and land use, like Ozark National Scenic Riverways? Or was it one of like the big early crown jewels like Yellowstone, Yosemite, Mammoth Cave, Rocky Mountain National Park, all created very early? Acadia National Park out in Maine, created very early. Or was it a third wave, like some of these heritage corridor places where we're starting to see that having Yellowstone in Yosemite, running Yellowstone in Yosemite, the other crown jewels. It's awesome. But it's not enough because it doesn't connect with a lot of people. So, take a look at the number attached to the label on your park. What year was it created? But based on the resources that are held forward the most, is it a first, second, or third wave park? Is it about outstanding, unique places like the Yellowstone caldera, and there's just nothing like it anywhere else in the world? Or is it like the Cuyahoga River is a pretty bog standard river, but it's got a huge, rich American tapestry of history attached to it, and so that's pretty much one of our third wave places. And going down the Cuyahoga, going to any of the sites along the Cuyahoga, some of these old factories, it doesn't look like anything you'd expect for a national park at all whatsoever. It's a working river. But there's a lot of stories to tell there. It's a pretty cool spot to visit if you're ever up that way. Okay? So, anybody? First, second, or third wave park? This is not a formal classification. It's just what general sort of bin does it fall into? So let's hear from you guys. First, second, or third wave park?
Olympic would be first. It was established in 1938.
Yeah, 1938, during the Great Depression, when the federal government is carving out huge chunks of land. Was there anything of like an outstanding natural character that's unique, kind of dominates its landscape? That's a very first wave kind of thing. Is there anything like that at Olympic?
Yeah.
The Olympics, yeah, exactly. Right, not a trick question. Anybody else? What about Isle Royal? 1940s, all right, so does that probably put it in first or second wave, would you say? Is it outstanding and unique in terms of its natural character? More of a cultural site? More of a urban place? Cultural, okay. So that might tip it into second. Cool. Anybody else? When was U.S. Virgin Islands? Say again?
Maybe
50s. All right, second wave. Cool. It's not huge, but it is pretty beautiful and natural in its way. Okay. Cool. All right, let's take a quick break here. We'll stretch our legs and so forth, and then we'll get into the back half of class and wrap it up.
She'll be 7 in like 10 days. Yeah.
Well, they played softball whenever the sun was out last year. Yeah. I'll take your buddy.
Yeah, driving.
She hates color.
Yeah.
She likes the vet though. I mean, the vet people.
Yeah, I looked over and I noticed your doodles. It was very nice. I have this deer that I've been working on since Wednesday.
Yeah, Indiana Dunes. A lot of natural tales that we have.
Oh,
That's why I don't like that's so
Why we're in high school,
It's Los
So,
Angeles.
I
I guess they're yeah.
And instead of showing up with like a folding chair, you just show up with
And
those
like
things.
I work at the outdoor learning center, so my friends really got me into outdoor stickers, like life and adventure. So yeah, need to get a new one and fill up some more.
I was just walking by that his sports line on the
Yeah. Oh yeah. It is nice. Yeah. I tried joining the team last fall semester, and they're very really.
know.
You spend the break fulfilling it.
buddy of mine, he's the one who set that up.
How does that work?
This is the original students.
It's crazy.
Approached him about it.
You like survey.
Yeah.
Yeah, the thing's set up like over there, and there'll be like hills and everything, and then the guys down here, and they like that's crazy.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So I actually worked in the student center. So when I was at Starbucks, they had me go in, and like I had to like use chemicals to like upholster all the seats and stuff. And I did literally I graduated in that fall. I read online that they're doing esports league, and I was like, are you kidding me? Like after I graduated, this happened.
Yeah, he was super proud of it. He's like, man, the hardware we got in there.
Yeah, it's crazy. They got
And now with the chip shortage, everything is sky high expensive. So
Yeah.
I guess we got to
good old
just right.
scalpers too.
Yeah. All right, let's roll through the back half of class here for a bit, and we'll head not our usual direction around the lake. We're actually going to go over towards Becker Pavilion here and talk a little bit about infrastructure, human resources for your park. I like your shirt. And I like your shirt too. For those of you listening at home, we got a Red Rocks Canyon shirt and a Mountains Expedition. Let's just byline say, life is better with a little adventure. Those are highly appropriate for this class. Okay, so we're going to talk about kind of the flip side of the human layer of resources, not the stuff that we are trying to protect and curate and interpret and provide. We're going to talk about some of the infrastructure stuff that we use to provide it. So none of the stuff that we're talking about is the point. It's not the mission. It's just tools on how we get there. So if you are in charge of the Olympics, an Olympic National Park this semester, the mountain is the point. The trails on the mountain, not the point. But without those trails, a lot of people aren't going to be able to do their thing. Okay? So, for those of you listening at home, we are standing by Becker Pavilion at Campus Lake, in between the racked canoes and the John boat and the actual structure of the pavilion. And behind us or ahead of us, we got some paddle boats and a dock. So, all this stuff kind of adds up to a lot. There's a lot of equipment. There's a lot of structures. There's a lot of site hardening in terms of the paved concrete or tar and chip asphalt paths right behind you that go around Campus Lake. And the Park Service uses these things to protect the resources by not letting them get super muddy and not letting all of that fill in that lake habitat. Even though it's a created lake in our on-campus example, the Park Service isn't really doing that. But they are trying to keep the ecosystem here functional by not having it trampled to death, not loved to death, or Reddit hug of death, so to speak, in a recreation context kind of way. So the only difference here for this spot on Campus Lake versus your national park is this: the canoes and the watercraft for public use. The Park Service isn't in the business of getting you into a Park Service canoe and out onto the water. The Park Service is not a business. They're here to give you here this semester are here to give your recreationists, your visitors, your users, access to the opportunity to get out on the water with the canoe in a way that doesn't tear up the land, doesn't screw up the water, doesn't scare away all the wildlife or club the wildlife over the head, etc. Okay? So, we have a whole other major and program for being the person getting folks out in the canoe. It's the Outdoor Rec program, and the adventure leadership sort of specialization or track within that. This is like what they do, and it's awesome, and it's exhausting for people like me who are introverts and don't want to hang out with millions of people 24 hours a day leading trips. So if you're wired to be like an outfitter or a guide or something like that, we're talking about being the folks as the Park Service or the Forest Service or BLM or whomever. We're the ones making sure that there are enough, but not too many, boat ramps, launches of the right kind, and hardening and resource protection capability, and so forth. Okay? So think about your park's map on your mind's eye without any kind of infrastructure like roads or the water treatment plants, the sewer treatment plants that are critically important in parks. So 2 or 3 million visitors per year, however many you have, whatever that number is, all of those people are creating feces and urine and feminine products and excreting birth control in their urine and wearing sunblock and bug dope and we bring a lot of chemical presence into parks as recreationists. Well, the Park Service, we're going to be running some water treatment plants, and those might not be marked on your recreation map, but they're there. They're often painted the same color as the ground nearby and hidden behind shielding trees, because when you go to a park as a visitor, you don't want to see water towers and sewage treatment ponds, even though we need those things. Otherwise it gets real disagreeable real fast, and so forth. So this is infrastructure. This is facilities. This is the built and designed environment. Jack, you were just at Shenandoah National Park, a beautiful place. Okay, what constructed and designed facilities did you use while you were at Shenandoah National Park, just outside of Washington, D.C., about 70 miles away?
Main structures like the visitor center.
Visitor center.
And established shelters.
Shelters.
Or at the peaks.
The trails. Did they have anything built at the peaks?
Mostly shelters. They had local shelters or picnic areas,
Picnic areas.
lodges. They had multiple lodges along the route.
Big old lodges. Did the lodges have gift shops? Nice.
They had camp stores scattered all over. They had restaurants scattered all over.
Camp stores, dumpsters.
Information centers. Stuff like that.
Information centers. Before you left, we talked about gas stations at Shenandoah. Because it's, 70 miles long, something like that? And people are going to get up there from D.C. and need to refill their cars. So, typically as recreation rangers, as park planners, rec techs, any of the kind of job titles that are the usual suspects, forestry technicians, all that stuff, we're not really thinking along the lines of having to run a gas station. And so a lot of those sort of money handling things to do stuff on site typically run by concessions. That's part of our infrastructure. So private companies run those lodges. Private companies like Xanterra, they hire thousands and thousands of people every year to there are multiple like full-size cafeteria style restaurants in South Rim Village at the Grand Canyon, because there are millions of people there in the summer months and stuff like that, and most people are not bringing in a pallet of Mountain House stuff to be internally self-sufficient. They're arriving expecting steaks available in the middle of the desert on top of a plateau at 7,200 feet or 9,500 feet on the North Rim and so forth. So there's a ton of infrastructure. It's like running a city. And the park headquarters, you may not usually see that except in some smaller national parks where the primary visitor center has the admin complex kind of stapled onto the back of it, like at Ozark Scenic Riverways, for example. They've got LCD projectors and broadband internet and enormous secured hard drives for their GIS layers that they use to store all their resource management stuff and, the inventory and management data, all that. So there's a ton of infrastructure at these parks, and we want to think a little bit about that because most of the expense of running a national park typically isn't in managing random square meters of habitat way out there. It's in having to run roads up to a visitor center at 12,500 feet on the spine of the Rocky Mountain Range to get from the front half to the back half of Rocky Mountain National Park. So a couple of years ago they got a couple of $1 billion bucks to build and repair some of this stuff. As of a decade ago, they were in a $11 or $12 billion just maintenance backlog. So there are a lot of visitor centers and auxiliary facilities you'd see in the primary complex of any of these places, like the motor pool, the cafeteria, the trails workshop. There's a dozen or more different characteristic buildings that you find pretty much at every national park, every major national park. And some of them have leaky roofs because it's a visitor center. Anybody here who went on summer camp, did you get hot soup when we stopped at the top of the ridge line at Rocky? There's a little cafe restaurant up there. Can you imagine how expensive it is to run that place? I mean, imagine just you know how we get potholes at the end of every winter here in Carbondale from freeze-thaw and heavy trucks running over them? Imagine what that freeze-thaw is like at 12,500 feet. The freeze-thaw action here in Carbondale is a fraction of an inch. At Denali National Park, on their primary, the one road, literally the one road that goes through the middle of the wilderness there, those frost heaves can be over 6 feet. You literally can't pave that road, and they have to constantly be blading it out every single day that it's not freezing. Every single day. So, infrastructure, it's hard, it's expensive. It's really, really hard in some of these places that we love best as parks because 12,500 feet is just not like anywhere else. The salt water attacking anything that's metal in the U.S. Virgin Islands, the salt spray sort of blows inland on the wind. It's why you get that sort of slightly sticky feeling all over your skin when you're at the beach or near the coast. It's not just the humidity, it's the salt, which is hygroscopic, pulling humidity out of the oceanside air and sticking it against your skin. You're not sweating, it's clammy, it's like dew forming almost. It's just kind of a slimy, sticky feeling. That's a thing. And it also attacks the frame of every steel vehicle continuously in those places, right? So there's a lot of rust bucket cars in Detroit in the Rust Belt. That's why it's called the Rust Belt, because of salt. And the same thing is happening naturally all over the place, 24/7, 365, at some of these coastal parks. So think about kind of beyond the forestry, traditional ecosystem land management. Think about a trail and maintaining it. So at Denali National Park, it is required by Congress to be a trailless place. They are not allowed to put in or allow visitors even to create trails, and especially not allowed to allow poachers to create poaching extraction trails out of Denali. And that's a good thing, because it's consonant with the wilderness uses of backcountry. You want to be navigating, you want to literally be picking where you place every boot fall as you're navigating through a wilderness compartment at Denali National Park. Does your park have a wild space, maybe even a federally designated wilderness inside of it that might be like that? Does your park have that wilderness space filled with trails or not? Or even just a backcountry space, even if it's not federally designated wilderness? Do those trails go up above the alpine line, up into the cryosphere, the cold glacier fields, or cirques, or Nunatak, or whatever? Is that trail going to have insane frost heaving to the tune of 6 feet that you need heavy highway construction equipment even just to make that road passable every single day? Think about the infrastructure. There are a lot more jobs in parks than you are aware of, typically, until you start looking, because people aren't thinking along this line. We're thinking along I'm going to be out in the woods, I'm going to be the conservation police officer, and so forth. But what roads are you going to use as that conservation police officer or that forest protection officer, and so forth? Okay? So, this is going to be one of the more expensive parts of our semester. For those of you watching at home, we've acquired a dragonfly. It's nice. It's blue. Iridescent. So think about your park's infrastructure. What kinds of stuff does your park have? Let's hear it.
You got a coral reef bay with trails running through underwater.
Okay, so the infrastructure is the trails underwater. Now that's probably not a trail surface like we're thinking about surface trails. What does that physical built facility look like? Is it buoys?
I bet you it's like, probably a buoy with like a little obstacle underneath. And they got like art wall engravings, probably.
Yeah.
All that kind of stuff.
Yeah. You guys ever seen a little chip of color along the side of a trail? What's that called? Anybody know?
Trail mark.
It used to be called blazes. But a blaze was originally you take your knife or your hatchet and you chop a specific pattern or pictogram into a tree, and that's not good for the tree. So we don't do blazing anymore. So trail markers, sometimes you'll see them called reassurance markers. That is a part of the built facility. You have to order basically fiberglass or plastic stakes or have a trail shop with a bunch of woodworking tools, which is pretty sweet. You get to make a bunch of trail markers on the lathe or whatever, or the router, and somebody's got to go out there with a post hole digger or shovel and dig them in, and then when they get too busted and old or unsafe, you got to pull them out and replace them. Like, maintaining the infrastructure at your park is going to be a huge part of your daily lift. Your trail crews are going to have a lot of people on them because it's hard work. and you can't always get the dingo-sized, dishwasher-sized skid steer out there to do a bunch of hydraulically fossil fuel-powered work done for you. Okay, a lot of it's handwork. So, think about what your park needs in terms of infrastructure. Boat ramps, water treatment facilities, a satellite uplink for communication back to the Washington office. Is it way out there? There are some places in Alaska where there are literally no roads that go there. What kind of infrastructure, what kind of equipment and vehicles do you need for that? Float planes, like UTVs, like true UTVs that can really go anywhere, like a Unimog, right? Some of this equipment is pretty specialized and weird. So you're not going to find much mention of infrastructure per se. You'll find some hints in the things to do link at your park on the Park Service website. It'll list things like hiking, and from there you can infer we're going to need some trail markers and trailhead signs and parking lots and roads to connect it all together and pamphlet maps and waterproof boxes to stick those pamphlet maps in and a visitor center to hand them out at and people staffing the visitor center and power lines running to the visitor center and water acquisition and treatment to keep those flush toilets running.
I just saw the Virgin Islands recently got approved for a landfill. I mean, it's like we're here for the trash.
A landfill in a park. Does that scream world-class resource preservation to you?
It's either that or the ocean.
It's either that or the ocean. At Carlsbad Caverns, they had to put in parking lots. They put the parking lots right over the caverns. Some of the cars drip oil, antifreeze, transmission fluid, a little bit of whatever. Occasional rains wash it down into the caverns. Screw up everything. Kind of forever. Big ouchie, bro. Real kick in the knackers, as they would say in Letterkenny. Like, oops, infrastructure has some real teeth. We have to have it, otherwise everything's going to get loved to death. But if we do it wrong, they're going to name that management case study after us, and that's bad. Okay? Cool. Let's end it right there. I want to give you guys a little bit of extra time to kind of research this for your park. Again, we have at least 3 different types of human-type resources, right? Cultural, historic, prehistoric, the infrastructure resources. So, in order to really fully get this, we're going to have to know a lot about why our visitors are coming to our park. What's their reason or motivation? Because that's going to dictate where they go and the facilities they need while they're there. But we're not quite to that part yet. So put a pin in the motivation piece of it. Look for hints in the trails and boat ramps, visitor centers, the built environment. All right? Any questions about this so far? I'm around for questions. You guys are clear for takeoff if you want to go. Otherwise, see you on Wednesday. Yeah. All right, cool.